All right, guys, here we're going to be doing the precipitation reactions. I'm going to be going through each of the groups and going through them same order that they are appearing in the lab. So right here we have 5 test tubes set up with the nickel 2 nitrate, and we're going to start in the first test tube, the one furthest to the left, by adding a few drops of the sodium hydroxide to this, and let's see what happens. Right, so I added a few drops. You can record the results that you get from that. Right. And I guess I could bring it a little bit closer to you so you can see that. So that was with the sodium hydroxide. All right, next up is going to be the sodium chloride. So add a few drops of the sodium chloride here. So that was the sodium chloride. That. Next up we have the sodium phosphate. Shake. As you can see, this one was with the sodium phosphate. Next up, we have sodium carbonate. The sodium carbonate. And last but not least, we have the sodium sulfate. All right, so those are all the ones with the nickel 2 nitrate. All right, so here we have our iron 2 nitrate. On all the solution sheets, it's a nice orange solution. We're going to add the same things that we added to the previous one. So we are going to start off by adding our sodium hydroxide. So let's get that one ready. Add a few drops of the sodium hydroxide. We'll see what that looks like. Focus. So that's after a few drops of sodium hydroxide. All right, next up is going to be the sodium chloride. Added a few drops of the sodium chloride. We're now going to add a few drops of the sodium phosphate. So a few drops of the sodium phosphate. See what that looks like. Now for the sodium carbonate. So we added a few drops of the sodium carbonate. And our last one is going to be the sodium sulfate. That's with the sodium sulfate. So these were all solutions of our iron 2 nitrate, and we added the different aqueous solutions to those. All right, let me change out our solutions. We will go to another one. So next up is going to be our copper 2 nitrate, and you will notice that for copper we have this brilliant blue color, which is very indicative of a lot of our copper solutions, which have roughly the same amount in each test tube. Roughly, some have a little bit more than others. Right, so these again are going to be our copper 2 nitrates, and we're going to start off with the sodium hydroxide, once again going from left to right. So a few drops of the sodium hydroxide. I'll give that a swirl. You can see what that looks like. So that's after a few drops of the sodium hydroxide. We're now going to add the sodium chloride. Give that a swirl. So we have a few drops of the sodium chloride added to this. We're going to add now a few drops of the sodium phosphate. Let's see what that looks like. Give it a little bit of a swirl for us. A few drops of our carbonate. And then, last but not least, we're going to have a few drops of the sulfate. So those are all of the copper 2 nitrate solutions, and you can see the results here. I'm going to switch these out. Next up is going to be my Cobalt 2 nitrates. Cobalt has this beautiful red color, right? Like a blush red, almost pink. Right, so that's our cobalt solutions. All of these are Cobalt 2 nitrate, and we're going to go through the same exact addition. So we'll start off with the sodium hydroxide. Right. Add a few drops of that sodium hydroxide to this. I'm going to bring that a little closer so we can see before I give it a swirl. Okay. Next up is going to be the sodium chloride. Let's add a few drops of our sodium chloride. Now we're going to have our sodium phosphate. So this is with the sodium phosphate. Give that a little bit of a swirl. Now have our sodium carbonate. And then last but not least, sodium sulfate. I'll bring that a little closer. Give that a swirl for you. All right, so once again, these are all of our copper 2 nitrate solutions. We added the sodium hydroxide, the sodium chloride, sodium phosphate, sodium carbonate, and your sodium sulfate. Okay. Let's take these out. All right. Next up, we have our calcium solutions. So these are all calcium nitrate solutions. Start off with the sodium hydroxide. We're going to do the sodium chloride. Now do our sodium phosphate. Next up is going to be our carbonate, our sodium carbonate. Then our sodium sulfate. So that was all of the calcium nitrates, the different salts that we had. Now we are going to have our potassium nitrates. So let's start by adding the sodium hydroxide. We're then going to add sodium chloride. Let's add our sodium phosphate. Add our sodium carbonate. Then the sodium sulfate. So those are all of the the potassium nitrates reacting with the different sodium salts that we had. And we can see those results there. All right, so you have all of these results now. You should be able to complete the rest of that lab. Best of luck.